Within like 2 seconds of hearing a song, you know if it was mixed by an amateur. There seems to be this common theme that people new to mixing music just tend to always do. So this video is going to look at the top 8 things that beginning mixing and mastering engineers do that tend to ruin their songs. And I'm also going to show you what to listen for and how to avoid those pitfalls. So if you mix and master music, you are in the right spot. And before we jump into the video, I want to let you know that I have a free gift for you. In the description is a link to download my favorite free mixing and mastering plugins guide. So if you're looking for a few extra tools or need something to inspire some creativity, that guide is for you. So let's start with something that will just absolutely ruin a song. One of the biggest things that beginners tend to do is they either have a vocal that is way, way overly sibilant, or they've gone and way overcorrected using a de-esser or something. So just for demonstration purposes, I've gone ahead and disabled the de-esser I had on the vocal, and I've also added this plugin to just kind of enhance the sibilant region. So this is in the same range where a lot of people tend to do EQ boost to the vocals, but if you boost everything, there'll be certain sounds that really accentuate that region, like T's and S's. Like the should have known from the start, like the S on the start and then the T, it just really jumps out of the mix and it's kind of piercing. Listen again. So to fix this problem, the easiest way to do it is to use a de-esser. One that I like to use is by Waves. It's called Sibilance. And the trick with this is to try to catch those bright peaks without affecting anything else in the vocal. If you overuse a de-esser, it's going to make the vocalist have a lisp, okay? So we're going to try really hard to be careful with this and just capture the peaks that jump out of the mix, okay? Right, especially right in this region. The best way to make sure that we're dialing in this plugin is to actually click this monitor button. What this does is it lets you hear what this plugin is taking away from the vocal. So if we were to dial this in perfectly, we would just hear those S's and the T sounds that are sibilant and nothing else. So let's play this vocal and see if we can dial it in so we're just capturing the sibilant sounds. Here we go. So it's pretty good, but you can hear that it's still attenuating some of the vocal that isn't all just the sibilant parts. So we probably want to try a different plugin and see if we get a better end result with that. But this one tends to be really aggressive, so you have to be very careful and you need to listen and make sure you're not taking out too much of those sounds because you're going to lose the presence and the closeness of the vocal and trade that in with someone that has a lisp. This de-esser is doing the job. It's grabbing all of those S sounds and yanking them straight out of this mix. All right, the second biggest mistake that beginning mixing and mastering engineers do all the time is they'll put a limiter on their drums to try to increase the level or loudness of the drums. But what they do, and they don't realize it, is they squash their snare drum or their kick drum and they make it lifeless. Now, you don't have to just throw this on the drum bus. You can also just have it on the snare track and ruin it that way. So let me show you what that sounds like and how to avoid it. So for example, let's just play the drums. So something I'm always watching out for is when somebody comes over here and they're like, I love the way my drums sound. I just wish that snare was louder. So I'm going to use a limiter to then crush it into oblivion and then make it louder. It will make it louder, but it's going to lose all of its impact. So let's see what that sounds like. So when you do that initially, you might be like, yeah, this sound is huge. Listen to how big the snare is now. But here's the thing, it might not be that huge. It might just be louder. I'm gonna adjust the output ceiling to make sure that the level is the same when we bypass this limiter. So what I'm gonna do is play this and turn this limiter on and off. Now what I want you to focus on is the punch in the power in the lower bass region of the snare. Here we go. Something else you should notice is that when the limiter is on, it feels like the snare is actually deeper into the mix, okay? Listen for that sense of depth. So when the limiter's on, we're increasing the relative level of the room sound, but it's at the cost of a loss of power and punch from the snare, and also psychoacoustically pushes the snare back. So really try to avoid this at all costs if you can. If you want to use something else, what I recommend doing is using maybe a compressor instead. Make sure that you have a longer attack. You want like at least 30 milliseconds of attack. Otherwise, you're going to start strangling your snare transient, or just turn the volume up on the drums. The third deadly sin that beginning mixing and mastering engineers do that will ruin their mix is use stereo enhancers. That's right, stereo enhancers. They do so much damage. You get width from mixing the elements well together. You get width from the arrangement. And you can also get fake width with a stereo enhancer. But that fake width doesn't solve any of the underlying problems. And all it does is smear everything out and potentially take away all the power from your mix. And I'm going to show you right now. Let's just go right to the mastering chain and throw on a big ol' stereo enhancer. Let's do S1 by Waves. I actually like this stereo enhancer when it's used extremely subtly, okay? I'm talking like maybe shuffles at 1.1 or 1.2, and this width is maybe no more than 0.07. Much more than that, you'll hear it starts messing with the mix, and it just isn't a good thing. All right, let me just show you. So here's the thing. As soon as you start widening something, you get used to that sound, and then you lose perspective. When we go back to 1, it's like, oh, it feels really narrow. I can't believe that we liked that before. That's because we lost perspective. So when we're doing this, what you really should be listening for is try to like visually identify where everything is. As soon as it's hard to pinpoint where things are, it's too wide, it's too unnatural, and you lose cohesiveness of the mix. And the other thing that stereo enhancers always tend to do, in my opinion, they'll mess up the punch and the impact and the transients of the song. So you'll be pushing it wider, and then all of a sudden your snare gets really weak. And it's a very strange thing, or your kick will just disappear, right? So I want you to listen to the kick and snare in the transients as I push this width up, and see if you can identify that loss of power. So right here, we're starting to lose that sense of cohesiveness in the song. And then at this setting, we're starting to lose the impact of the kick drum and the snare drum, okay? So be very, very careful when you play with this. Again, really make sure you're focusing on the sub-frequencies, because that tends to get disrupted. All right, the fourth biggest mistake that I see all the time is when mixing and mastering engineers use way too much reverb in their mixes, especially on vocals. Now, that is very different compared to if you're using delays or echoes or reverbs for a stylistic decision on the song. You got to be really careful about how much reverb and delay you put, because you're going to make it really messy and muddy, and you're going to lose clarity, and the vocalist is going to sound really deep in the mix and buried, okay? All right, I'm just going to use a really quick, easy to use, free reverb. Comes with Cubase, and then put the mix at 50 just so we can hear it. But miles apart, when I'm tired of closing the day. A lot of times people will reach for a reverb when they want it to sound lush. When you want something to sound lush, I suggest using delays over reverbs because reverbs will psychoacoustically push the vocalist deeper into the mix. When people are trying to get the vocal to sound continuous and flowy, and you reach for a reverb, and then you get a lot of mud, a lot of weird sizzle stuff, and then it just turns into this weird soup with a buried vocalist. So let me show you what it sounds like as I increase the amount of reverb we have on the vocal. Like, you notice how the vocalist felt like you just getting sucked into a black hole? That's too much reverb. You can also hear that if you don't have the EQ and the balance right, it also is really distracting. So there's too much high in that reverb, and it sounds sizzly. So let's get rid of that first. We're only far away, but miles apart. When I'm tired of closing the distance. All right, so that's a better level for the high frequencies, only 10%. That's crazy. We still have a lot of mud, okay? So let's pull some of this down. And this is still way too much reverb because it feels like the vocalist is way too far back. So to find the right amount of reverb, just close your eyes and listen to the song and adjust this mix knob, and then stop when you feel like the vocalist is in a good spatial relationship to the rest of the instruments in the song. Here we go. Honestly, I think it's the 1%. I wouldn't want to put any more reverb than that. It's starting to push the vocalist too far back in the mix. We need a drier vocal for this to keep up with the dense guitars. So a better approach in this song would be maybe not reverb, but maybe using delays just to add length. So the fifth biggest mistake that I see all the time is they let a bad performance just kind of go. Or they try to edit the performance, but did a terrible job. Let me just give you a little news flash here. If you listen to any song on the radio or any of your favorite songs, odds are, if there are any mistakes, they do not take away from the experience of listening to the song. If any little thing takes you away from enjoying the song to like, oh, that was kind of a weird note, or oh, he was like off the beat there. You know, if any of those things cross your mind, the performance either needs to be edited or you need to re-record the performance. That's it. There's no getting away from this. This is what makes an amateur bedroom producer different from the professionals. The professionals have a tuned ear to listen to the performance of all the things and make sure that they're all talking to each other. If one of these things is off, it makes the song have less energy, less impact, and it doesn't connect to the audience in the same degree. So make sure that you take time to edit your songs or play them really well. But a lot of times we can't play our songs very well, myself included. So we need to learn how to edit. And if you want to learn how to edit better, or you don't want to have to dig around on YouTube and try to find 100 different tutorials to figure this crap out, I have an editing course in the description that you can go and check out. There's also like a 10% off coupon in there. Use that. I promise you it's going to be a game changer for your sound, but do not skip that step because that is a huge giveaway that your songs were not professionally produced. The sixth biggest mistake that beginning mixing and mastering engineers make all the time that ruin their mixes is when they use one plugin to try to do too much. Now, the biggest offenders I usually see for this is putting a limiter on the master bus when really they should be using smaller amounts of compression on the group or the bus level, and that's all that's needed. So let me show you in this session. I'm just going to pull up the mastering chain I have for this song since I'm the one that mixed and mastered it. So let me just show you how many different stages of compression I have and limiting. Okay, so I have an SSL bus compressor by Waves. I have this FGX mastering thing by Slate Digital. And then it goes into a linear multi-band compressor. And then it goes into Pro L. Okay? I have 3 stages of compression and clipping and limiting before it even gets to the limiter. Let's see how much I do at each stage. All right, this compressor doing about 1 to 2 dB, just ticking it so that it adds a little bit of punch. Notice the attack is at 30, not at 0.1. It's because we want to preserve the impact. We talked about that earlier in this video. Let's see what Slate Digital FGX is doing. 1/2 of a dB. Just touching it and squeezing off any of those little transients that might be getting a little bit too pokey. It's chopping the tops off and fattening it up. And then we have this linear multi-band compressor. What's this doing? So this is actually doing quite a bit. This is like anywhere from 1 to maybe 3 dB, but it's not continuous, right? It's in different discrete bands, and this is just to help try to gel everything together, okay? And then what's the limiter doing? About 1/2 dB, and then the snare hits, it's taking about 2 dB. Notice it's not continuous. It's just on the loudest transients, right? Now, if we were to get rid of all these little pieces along the way, and we're trying to get the same loudness with the limiter, look at how much work this limiter has to do. And notice we can't even get it to be like as loud as it was before, and it's starting to break up and get distorted, right? And we're losing the punch, okay? So try to remember, when we're doing any type of digital signal processing, every single tweak we make, we're giving something up from the song. There's always a trade-off. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And this is especially the case when you have one tool that does a lot of processing. All right, I'm done ranting about that. The 7th biggest thing that I see mixing and mastering engineers making in their songs is not really understanding how compressors work and not being able to hear the movement a compressor adds to the song. They'll maybe have the attack too fast or too slow to do what they're trying to accomplish, or the release times are too long and it kind of negates what they're trying to achieve. And that basically comes down to a misunderstanding of how attack and release work. So I'm going to try to break this down to help you understand that and dial it in just right for your song. And if you want to go deeper into compression and how to hear it and understand what all the different flavors sound like, I have a really, really good video right over here. Definitely go and take a look at that. All right, let's go back to our drum example. All right, so here I'm using FabFilter Pro C2 on the drums. And you might be looking, you're like, what are you doing, Bobby? You have almost 9 dB of gain reduction. The difference is that I'm using that 9 dB of gain reduction to add movement and impact to the drums, okay? This is giving the song a sense of depth and space that would be missing if we did a lot less. And this is part of my style as a mixing engineer for getting these really big over-the-top sounds. Now, if you notice, my attack time is greater than 30 milliseconds. That seems to be the magic window to my ears when the snare drum has a lot of power. And if you put a compressor on a drum bus, you need to make sure there's enough time to let those transients come through. Now, this is not enough time to let the kick drum come through. So let me show you what happens if we have really fast attack time. We'll keep the release the same. Everything is nice and loud and big, but it's flat, right? There's no power. As we roll this attack and open this up bigger and bigger, what's going to happen is you're going to start hearing the snare drum punch coming through. So you hear right around 30 milliseconds or so, we're starting to get the punch of the snare drum to cut through. Whereas when we had a really fast attack, it just stayed pretty lifeless and strangled. Right there, right around 28, 30 milliseconds. Now, if we keep going, we're going to start letting the kick drum come through. So let's listen for that. So right around 80 milliseconds or so, now we're starting to get a little bit of the power from the kick drum cutting through, okay? So you have to find a good balance between getting the snare drum to be punchy and then also keeping the kick drum punchy. So let's set this back to where it was like the punchiest, which is around maybe 60 for this song. We're gonna make this release as fast as possible, and we're just gonna play this section, and I want you to listen to how the snare drum changes in terms of its impact and presence as we make this release longer and longer. Here we go. So the longer release times kind of mellow out the snare, right? It just makes it sound a little bit less aggressive. Now, something very important to get right is that if your release gets too long, if you have quick sequential snare drum hits, anything after that first snare drum hit is going to actually be softened, and that's because the compressor doesn't have enough time to release the volume back to its initial state. Watch out for that when you're setting your compressors. We've made it to the end. This is the 8th biggest mistake that I see beginning mixing mastering engineers make all the time. And coincidentally, I would also put professionals also make this mistake. And so that mistake is you do not reference enough when you're mixing and mastering music. And I can also say that this is also in the same vein as marathon mixing, where you're mixing for an hour or 2 hours without ever getting a new perspective on music. That is a huge problem that everyone in the community makes. It was such a problem for me that I literally have went out and bought a timer so I can set a timer for 5 or 10 minutes to remind myself to check in my references so that I don't lose perspective. What do I mean by all this? When you're referencing, it means that you take a break from the song that you're working on and then play something that you know sounds awesome, that sounds great. And then you let your ears just recalibrate to that sound, just for like 20 seconds max. It's also a good idea to listen to several songs, maybe 2 or 3 that you know sound really good, that have a nice contrast to them. That resets your brain so that when you come back to your song that you're working on, you have a fresh perspective and you can objectively notice when things are a little bit off. Okay, that's what I mean by checking in with your references. Now, this ear fatigue that happens to us happens more when we're in solo trying to do very fine surgical movements to our song. So the faster you can mix, the faster you can make a decision on what is really wrong or what needs to be done to your track, the better you are at maintaining perspective and the better your overall mix is going to be. So try to make decisions that are big and impactful, and don't get hung up on the small details because you'll lose perspective and you're going to need to check in with your references more frequently. I'm serious about this one. If there is one thing that you can take away from this video, it is this one point. So I'm super curious. Which one of these 8 mistakes resonated the most with you? Is there something that you know that tends to just always seem to screw up your mix? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And if you have a way to get around that potential problem that maybe I didn't mention in this video, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you approach fixing that problem. And don't be afraid to share this video with someone who might be struggling with one of these things that we talked about in the video today. I condensed the last 15 years of mistakes that I've been making into this video, so I'm sure it's going to be helpful. I want to remind you that in the description, I have a link to download my favorite free mixing and mastering plugins guide. And with that, I want to thank you so much for your time and attention today. My name is Bobby Balo, and I hope to see you in another video.